Hello and welcome to the New Orchard. Today I'll be talking to a UK-based architect about the industry, about the trends in the business, and about the replacement of what has been originally beautiful with what is currently extremely ugly, at least in my estimations. Let me try to set this up a little bit for you and explain why I wanted to have this conversation with my guest, Conor Lynch. As long as I can remember, I've always admired good designers. Who doesn't, right? Beautiful objects are desirable. I've admired people who could pull original ideas out of thin air and manifest them in real world in the guise of a product like the E-Type, the Jaguar E-Type, or something simpler and more ubiquitous like 1940s Vespa. Well thought out, with delicate attention to details, these products are imbued with timeless quality. A quality which makes people desire and admire them decades, if not centuries, after the designer has finished playing with the blueprint. Now, good design tends to radiate dedication and heart, commitment and uncompromising nature, in most cases a singular vision, which at times, I would say, even the designer themselves struggles to articulate. It's as if the idea itself came to them from some magical secret place accessible to selected few. Because of my, let's say, obsession with quality designs, I have also developed quite a strong affinity for architecture. I would often stop and admire beautiful buildings without consciously understanding why I was doing it. Just standing there and staring at the intricate details of Palace of Westminster in London for hours. Considering myself a classicist, I love traditionally designed dwellings and admired the master architects from a distant past. Architects like Christopher Wren, Michelangelo, Donato Bramante, Pellegrino Tibaldi, Zwirner or Voigtl, Gaudi, but also people like Etienne Louis Bullet, who just dazzled people with his grand, seemingly impossible projects. You have to ask yourself why people from all over the world come to London to admire St. Paul's Cathedral, or go to Vatican to see St. Peter's Basilica. My guess would be that majority of these people are secular. They don't necessarily journey to these places to connect with God in some meaningful way. They tend to do it because the grandeur and the beauty of these churches overwhelms them at all levels and makes them feel something special that they simply do not feel day to day. I'm not naive, I'm not saying here that everyone experiences these things, but people who are open to letting the art and the beauty interact with them certainly do. You also have to wonder, on the other hand, how come the ancients knew how to build buildings and structures 2,000-3,000 years ago that still stand today? Just take a look at Maison Carrère Temple, located in Nîmes in France, or Pantheon, arguably the most well-preserved architectural building from an ancient Roman era. What kind of people designed and made these buildings? What were the drivers and the incentives present in that old world that resulted in such timeless and, at least to me, infinitely beautiful structures? Let's try to compare that to what's being built today. It's hard not to feel depressed looking at the skylines of our modern cities. I ask myself, who are the modern architects and why they're designing buildings which to me seem oppressive in form and depressive in function? I wonder if this is the best a self-centered, increasingly nihilistic and a secular society can do. I honestly do not want to sound too dramatic, but I can't help but think that the consequences of surrounding ourselves with modern architecture maybe corrupts our souls and disconnects us from what's truly human. Take the buildings in the part of town where I work. To me, they resemble prisons, at least on the outside. No great ideas are conceived in prisons. I don't think any original thinking happens in prisons, at least not the kind of ideas of thinking that can impact on rich society at a broader scale. I recently watched this documentary titled The Lost City of Melbourne. Its focus was the attempted so-called modernisation of Melbourne in the 1950s, which saw many of the city's most impressive and monumental buildings destroyed, including all but a few of its elegant cinemas and picture palaces. It was honestly beyond belief how anyone in charge of municipal planning, any governmental body responsible for approving construction, would sign such a destructive project off, but they did, and they did that relentlessly and with utmost dedication to the Great Modernisation Plan. Some of the characters featured in the documentary had nothing but pride for their role in that destruction, Down with the old and up with the new modern blocks of concrete and glass, they said. Watching this documentary made me a little bit curious, so I've decided to find out who out there and where in the world is bringing sophistication and artistry back into architecture and construction engineering. And this is essentially what brings me to our guest today. Conor Lynch, who I'll be talking to shortly, posted a bunch of short videos with a commentary about few construction projects in Hungary, which instantly captured my attention. I know Hungary a little bit. I travelled through that beautiful country and stayed in Budapest for slightly over 2 weeks, approximately 10, maybe 12 years ago. I thought that Budapest was an absolutely gorgeous city, especially at night when all the buildings and key bridges on the river are beautifully illuminated. Hungarians knew how to design and build. That was evident to me. The Parliament building, Matthias Church, Hungarian State Opera, or even the New York Palace building, just to name a few of great examples of the architectural ambition, prowess and vision from the past. What I wasn't aware of was that the national government there was involved in the rebuild/restoration project of the Buda Castle Palace district site. I got in touch with our guest to find out more about the project, but also to get a bit of an update on the state of play in today's architecture. I also wanted to ask Conor about why beauty in architecture matters, and why it's worth going against the current and striving for that beauty as a young designer. I hope this gives you enough of an idea what this episode will be about. So with all of that said and done, let's dive into it. Good evening, Mr. Lynch, and welcome to the New Orchard. How are you today?
Very well, thank you very much for inviting me on.
Likewise, thank you very much for making time for us. How about we kick off with a little introduction? Tell us a little bit about yourself. Who is Conor Lynch? Where are you based? And tell us a little bit about the path that has led you to work in the architecture industry.
Well, right now I'm in the south of England, practicing classical architecture, working mostly on country houses, estates, and everything that comes with that. So from the house to the gate lodge, stable block, whatever you can think of on a country estate, architecturally, I am involved in projects like that at the moment. But how I got to this particular position right now is from a young age, loving history, loving old buildings, and particularly drawing. I would draw for entertainment, so I didn't look at TV. I would use my own imagination to create scenes on paper and create a world. And I think that's the magic of architecture that I still carry today, which is to turn an idea on paper into a tangible reality. So my idea for a building, a stable block, to see that come into fruition, and it's on a building site and it's rising up and then it's finished and you can touch it, it's real, there's people interacting with it. That to me is the magic of architecture. But in school I did the same subjects as everyone else, except I would generally sit near the back of class drawing buildings rather than listening to what the teacher was saying. So I was always going to do architecture. And when it came to university, I went in first year loving classical architecture, traditional buildings, but I soon learned that the lecturers really don't like that at all. And I was introduced to terms such as pastiche, and they'd say invalid, immoral, and essentially you cannot practice the classical tradition in university. It was completely verboten. And I, coming from school where you do what the teacher says, I carried that forth into university. And if the teacher says no classicism, then I park it. And I did. And in the first project, I did some awful minimalist box on the lakeside. And the visiting guest loved it. And I thought, oh, that's great. Great marks, grades, and all that. But in semester 2, they said, everyone has to do a book review. And the book I was assigned was called Modern Architecture Since 1900. And in that book, there's one page about new classical architecture, and it quotes Quinlan Terry. And I saw a photograph of Richmond Riverside in London, which was built in the 1980s, mid-80s. And Quinlan Terry, who I see as carrying the torch of tradition during the darkest years of modernism in the late 20th century. He designed these buildings looking to the Victorian Georgian tradition of architecture in England and in Richmond itself. So very much looking to the local character and architectural compositions. And when I saw the photograph and it said built in 1985, I thought this couldn't be right. My lecturers told me we don't build like this anymore. There must be a mistake. And then I Googled Quinlan Terry and I discovered country houses and all sorts of buildings that he had designed. And that led me down a rabbit hole of a few other architects who were designing in this way. And so in the second semester, I decided, well, they maybe the lecturers don't realize these people exist. Now, this was the innocence of coming out of school into university that I genuinely thought maybe they were mistaken. But of course, I soon learned upon designing a classical building that it was no mistake. It was very much an ideological position, and the attraction they had to my first semester project was quickly dashed by my second semester. This classical building seemed to bring out an odd character in the professors of, they said it was immoral, it's invalid. How could I possibly want to produce something like this? And I was amazed that such a simple, I suppose if you want to call it Georgian style house, quite traditional house, sash windows, pitched roof, chimneys, how it could arouse such protestation, vitriol in a way. And anyway, that was the rest of my university career, was very much designing classical buildings, failing, and then that summer producing a minimalist design over the space of 3 weeks, submitting it, passing, and then getting into the next year. So it's not a way to do a university course, but anyway, that's how it was. And I went to the architectural archive where I spent most of my time. This is beautiful Georgian library, tall ceilings, old books, and I had the place to myself. And I went there, and that was my university. So I had old books, old drawings, and I taught myself the classical tradition from the masters of the past. I wasn't going to learn it off any living architect, so I had to look into the architects prior to when modernism became a thing. So pre-20th century. And a lot of the books I would have looked at were 15th century, 16th century, many of which were 18th century, because a lot of the buildings I like most are early Georgian. To me, a house built between 1685 and 1720 is just it seems to be a beautiful period for architecture. It's after the Restoration. It's you have English Baroque, but it's before the Whigs, which were in the early 18th century. And it's this transition into the simplicity of late Georgian, but it's still got the beautiful proportions of the late Restoration, Charles II, which is 1660, 1685. But anyway, that's historical. The point is that you have to, and I'm afraid I think it's still the case today. If you want to do the classical tradition, you have to teach yourself. And every single year, you have thousands of graduates from architectural schools, and they are all leaving with ideas of glass and concrete and whatever the next eyesore to hit your town. That's the winning prize in one of these universities. And that's a pity, but there is a growing number of classical architects.
Yeah, it's strange, but it
Yeah.
doesn't surprise me. It doesn't surprise me that the definition of beauty has inverted in architecture as well, because it has inverted in so many other categories, in art and music and sculpture and so many other things. What's also sort of strange and sad at the same time is what you said about going into the institutions, wanting to diversify your knowledge, wanting to learn new things, wanting to also learn classical principles, but not having anyone to learn from when you had to kind of do it yourself. which is quite unfortunate for people who really decide and pay, crazy amounts of money to go through these institutions. I suppose what I would love to ask you about is what do you think the profile of a sort of average architecture student is? And I know I'm asking you to generalize this. Yes, there's obviously diversity between people and they're all slightly different, but there must be a kind of a unifying quality and character. I don't want to sound like I'm accusing anyone of anything. This whole conversation is about learning new things for myself and exploring this subject matter. Because what I'm wondering is, if you do have natural passion and interests and you enter the school with these qualities, what happens at the university level? Do they just kind of gradually beat it out of you, over time, and then you walk out and be like, okay, cool, let's do some concrete and glass, then that's how it's going to be. Like, what are you seeing on the ground?
Yes, they very much do beat it out of you in that sense. I did have colleagues in first year in university who would also design a traditional building. They came from a countryside village or town, beautiful houses all around, and of course the first project was perhaps design a house, and so they thought, well, I know what a house looks like. I'll think of my locality, and they designed quite a lovely central door with maybe an arched fan light, and there's windows either side, sash windows. There's 2 stories. There's eaves. There's maybe a cornice, a pitched roof, and tall brick chimneys. And the thing is that after five, like the course is about 5 years long, or 6 years, I suppose, if you count the gap between part one and part two. Um, and it can be tough. There were times that I was thinking of leaving the course. So, to put it in perspective, I had a crit. So, a crit is when you're presenting a project, a brief is given, and a few months later, there's a presentation in front of all your colleagues, and chairs are set out, and you have your lecturers, and they have guests coming in, and they will it's called crit for critique. They will critique your project, ask you questions and all that. But the thing is, if you design according to how they design, they won't pick it apart. They will they love it. They will probably say, did you think of doing the roof like this or the color like that? They will agree with it in principle and then just maybe have subtle changes, and maybe you put the entrance over there or something. But with a traditional design, it's so fundamentally against their core, their fundamental beliefs, which they inherited from their architectural school. And after 5 years, I had friends who in first year were saying, Connor, isn't it mad that they're saying this to you for designing a classical building? And by fifth year, they were saying the exact same thing that the professors were saying when we were in first year. They would say, well, Connor, what you're doing is mad. It is pastiche. We have to move on, like move on from beauty, move on from natural materials. It's completely absurd. We learn from our ancestors. Those who came before learned from those who came before them, and so on. And we're building upon. It's called wisdom and knowledge, and you inherit these things. You don't throw them away. And if a building has survived in this town or this climate or area for centuries, there's something to that. Well, it's a lot of the time it's the beauty of the building that people want to look after a building, or rather restore it rather than demolish it if it is beautiful. Beauty speaks to generations, it's timeless. And that's on the aesthetics, which is incredibly important, completely forgotten about, but also on the physical aspects. If you build with natural materials, you're facing natural elements. The Romans had to deal with rainfall and wind just as much as we do, and snow and whatever else. We are building with natural materials that are robust and facing the elements, and they survive. And if they're detailed correctly, they will survive indefinitely. And human occupation in a building will give the building a lifespan for however long we're around. The thing is, there's this approach they have, this ideology, whatever it is, that is completely against that way of doing it. Now, in recent years, because of just the public are fed up with a lot of what was being produced. Um, you could say there's some ground being given in the sense that you can see brick is slowly coming back in and timber is coming back in, but it's certainly not coming back in the way it was in the 19th, 18th, 17th century. It's not Flemish bond walls with brick arches. It's very much soldier bonds, common bond walls. So I'm going into architectural details now, but the bonding is the way in which bricks are laid out. It's almost as though, okay, we will use brick, but we're still not going to do it in a traditional way. It's this um, sort of opposition to tradition. It's bizarre, but it is there.
I think, yes, the opposition to tradition, that is something that has permeated so many industries and aspects of our culture. It's very interesting. I mean, beauty in what you're saying is becoming one of the key themes here, in sort of a desire to destroy what's beautiful and replace it with something that isn't. I suppose one thing that kind of popped into my head is a question about market forces, because where I live, the traditionally designed dwellings are the most expensive houses on the market. I've recently seen a house in a local area sold for, I think, $18 million. It's something that was built in 1910, I think, and it's beautiful, but it's not particularly big, and it's got some modern elements in it, like a swimming pool and a guest house and stuff like that. But and I see the same pattern in UK. Obviously, if you look at houses that are traditional design, houses from 100 plus years ago, they're very solid. Yes, they require some plumbing work and electric work in them, some form of modernization, but generally they're pretty solid, well built from very high quality materials. They're the most expensive. And then if we're talking about market forces, you'd think people would see an opportunity there, but like people really desire this sort of style, this sort of build quality. Like, why are market forces not reacting to it? And thinking about it, it's almost like all of the incentive that are interacting, they're sort of configured in such way that only this China-made prefabricated style is permissible. And one thing that I don't understand is why, if you go through 7 years of architecture school, you'd be excited about being a part of it. Like, that's like really puzzling. It's almost like there's nothing to design here, because these are all prefabricated. Everything looks the same. Like, did you not want to be a designer in the first place when you went to the architecture school? That's the confusing bit. That you see so very little of it. You just see this hyper progressive move towards flattening everything and creating this uniform sameness everywhere. That's
Yeah.
it's something that I can scratch my head about for a long time.
Well, yeah. Well, I think you've landed on it there with the prefabricated. Um, Now, I will touch on there are traditional buildings being built in England by developers that are sound, and that's in Poundbury. But I'll describe who that's led by, and that will make more sense. But it is short term versus long term thinking ultimately. But the prefabricated, it's quick. So labor is your highest cost of construction, and a truly traditional building will take longer to build. Now, if you're taking slightly longer to build something, but what you're building is going to last for centuries, now I would say that makes perfect sense. This is a home. This is something that will hopefully be passed down to the next generation, and so on. When we build cities, we are not building a place for 30 years, 50 years, 100 years. We should be, at least, and we were in the past, building with the intention of a long-term settlement. We are furnishing this place with beauty. It's a city, it's a place of settlement. And the mindset today, sadly, is, and it has been, I think, at least all my lifetime, short-term thinking. in architectural school, you're taught that your building will be demolished, most likely in 30 years, 50 years maybe. And most architects say, yes, that's fine. I'm happy with that. Maybe they got their piece in a magazine or whatever they put on their website, but in the long term, it doesn't matter. Um, Now, there are developers like building Poundbury. So working within, you're talking about the market, working within the conventions. When the Prince of Wales, now King Charles, set out to build Poundbury, these were based on the long term principles, traditional architecture, the classical tradition. But although he wanted all natural materials, and that's what it is now mostly, at the beginning he had to adhere to market forces, the conventional materials. So phase one of Poundbury, which started in the 90s, uses a lot of concrete, a lot of materials that don't age so well. Now it has overall aged well, but there are some of the downsides are the places they had to, just for basic economics, keep to the conventional materials at the time. But as time goes on, with supply and demand, there was more demand, of course, for traditional materials in the south of England for places like Poundbury. And so the cost of cut stone, the cost of chimney pots, brickwork has come down then since the 90s in respect to that, meaning that the final phases now of Poundbury, there's none of that synthetic material which doesn't age well. But that long term versus short term I was mentioning, this is those who have a stake in the future, and those who have a stake in the future long term, those who are short term, they want to make a quick buck and get out of town. So they'll come into your town, buy a plot of land, they will build whatever's quick to build, makes a lot of money, and then they get out of there. They don't have to look at it. They don't have to do anything with it. It just has to give a return on capital, and that's all it is. It's just purely commercial. And if previous generations did that, we wouldn't have inherited these beautiful cities. That's not to say that speculation, building for profit, is bad. A lot of the beautiful squares you see in London, they were a speculation. They were built in the hopes that someone would buy them, and therefore you would get a return on investment. But the difference here is there was clearly a long-term thought into the design. It is beautiful. It is timeless. Not necessarily physically timeless, because a lot of these buildings, I think of Georgian squares, if you can believe it, they don't have foundations. Now, I say maybe not physically timeless, they have stood the test of time. We build solid foundations today, making our buildings rigid. But of course, the Georgians, a lot of the time, of course, didn't have foundations. The buildings naturally settled. And if the land moves, if anything changes, the building can allow for that change. So, in a way, that probably is the long term way of doing it. But that's completely opposite to how we do it today. Now, that's the short term developer in for a quick buck and leaving town. The long term in England, you will find what are called legacy landowners. In the construction industry, they're called legacy landowners, and they tend to be old aristocratic families, nobility, who, for the most part, were wiped off the map in the 20th century through punitive taxation and um, yeah, well, mostly punitive taxation, whether it be on the size of a property, whether it be on inheritance, a number of aspects, and of course, then the dwindling income from agriculture. But so you have the duchy, which is the heir to the throne's estate, that, and the then Prince of Wales, King Charles, he, if it wasn't for him, traditional architecture wouldn't be where it is in this country. He led the way in the 90s, and he by seeing things like Poundbury when I was in university, it inspired me to sort of go more into that direction. It showed me there's a market for this. People are buying this, and if people are buying it, it's a viable career. You can have a career in this thing. Um, but outside the Duchy of Cornwall, there are places like Tornagrain in Scotland, and that's the Earl of Moray. Now, I think I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. My friend corrected me on it recently, and I think I've mispronounced it. But the Earl of Moray in Aberdeenshire, he's built Tornagrain. This town is in the Scottish tradition. Um, Someone who's never been there, they drive up to Tornagrain, they will sense that this is very much at home. It's got pitched roofs, tall chimneys, white walls, which are in the tradition of the area. And it's got a mix of cottages, mixed use. It's laid out for people to walk around where it might be a bit more awkward for cars. That's another thing. 20th century put cars ahead of people. Um, Now, unfortunately, there are people who take that too far and they're completely against private transportation and everything. I think we should design cities and towns for people, not for cars. Cars are for getting further afield. You should be able to get to school. Your kids should be able to safely walk to school. You should be able to walk to the shops, go to the doctor, whatever it might be, walking from your house. Now, to the shops, it might be 10 minutes. To the doctor, it might be half an hour, 20-minute walk. But the point being, you should be able to walk. And in new developments, particularly in the 20th century and in America, America's very bad for this. You have to get in your car to do anything. This not only leads to you depending on your car, but also a breakdown in community that you're not walking around, you don't see your neighbors, you're so far away from the shop that I was lucky to grow up in a village where we're very, very close to the shopkeeper. I know I walk down the main street and I know the shop owners and the pub owners. And it was because my village was built prior to the 20th century and it was laid out. You can walk everywhere and it's difficult to get around in a car and it's a very desirable place to live. And yet, if people were thinking, desirable place to live, how many car park spaces are there? There's very few car park spaces in my village, yet the property prices are very high. It's a complete The metric today for what makes a good place to live is completely warped, as does the metric for what makes a good house. They talk about this thing called, is the house, does it have an A rating, which relates to the U value. So they are rating a house based on its heat retention. So they say it's energy consumption. This ties back to the whole carbon obsession. But it's a completely bizarre metric, which a lot of people latch on to, and I think it's going to become law. Certainly in the rental market, they will say something like, "You cannot rent out a property unless it has this rating," meaning that nearly all old properties which don't meet that rating, most pre, I don't know, well, at least 18th, 19th century houses will have a D, E, F rating, whatever the lowest in the chart is, they will probably have that, meaning that if these houses can't be rented out, for example, a lot of them will fall into disrepair. They might be just neglected. They don't have a demand. I do see it going that way, but the metric is never, is it beautiful? Is it habitable? What is the rating for, how does it lend itself to human occupation? Now, of course, retaining the heat, you don't want a house that is just, you have radiators on, fires on, and it's just freezing cold. But to place that as the metric above all, it's created a system where fireplaces, which I grew up as a child playing on the carpet, an open fire, and a fireplace is part of the heart of the home. It's from our earliest habitation, the fire has been central to that. And to remove that from human life, I think is a tragedy. And I can guarantee you the people who are saying to remove the fireplace, they most certainly have a fireplace in their house, if not in a few rooms. Um, so these U value tests are leading to fireplaces not being built in new builds. Most new builds will not have fireplaces. Some will have, a lot will have fake chimneys because otherwise the roof line looks quite nude and monotonous with straight lines rather than some vertical um, items breaking the straight monotony of the roof. But it is a shame that we're losing things such as the fireplace, and there's the air tightness. It's leading, I think, to houses that are. Having grown up in a house that has a fireplace and has timber floors and traditional materials, and knowing beautiful houses and what makes a home feel that way, cozy and relatable and traditional, that is almost like it's been put out of reach for a lot of people because of these rules. And more so those, because they will always be the most desirable characteristics for a house. Back to what you said about these houses being the most expensive, if you stop building beautiful buildings that are with fireplaces and timber floors and high ceilings and cornices, if you stop doing that, then those that remain, because those are still the most desirable, that's what we want to live in. If you stop building like that, those that do exist will just go up and up and up in value, because of course the demand is still for them, but they're not being built. Um, yeah.
You're saying quite a lot of interesting things here. Two things come to mind. Number one, Prince Charles, well, King Charles now. I had no idea that he's involved in architecture projects. And while you were talking, I looked that project up, and it's quite beautiful. If I had the money and access, I'd definitely want to live in one of those houses. They look great. So good on him for getting involved in that. Guy's been getting a lot of flack for a lot of things, mainly his carbon obsession and affiliation with some nefarious organizations. But good on him that he's doing that, because that looks like an important project. And the second thing, that's probably quite naive, because I'm learning from you. This has been a good lesson. But looking at the landscape, there's quite a lot of threats coming into a lot of different industries through use of technology, machine learning and artificial intelligence. Everyone's talking about it, and quite a lot of progress has been made in that space over the last 24 months. I mean, the progress seems kind of almost exponential. So taking that threat into account, you'd think that students would go through university and would want to be more rounded and maybe push back a little bit on this demand for conformity, because you'd want to develop skills and kind of cultivate qualities in yourself that can be competitive with the machines, and you'd bring something human to the work and inevitably into the project. But again, listening to you, it would appear that that's not really how students, how the universities and the wider industry is looking at it. It's I've said it a few times today, but it's quite puzzling.
Well, I absolutely agree. I think that it's ridiculous that it takes all these years and you have to go through this indoctrination center to maybe go in with wonderful ideas of creating a beautiful square with houses and beautiful trees and everything. And after you come out the other end thinking that a glass wall is the greatest gift to mankind. So yeah, that is a very good point.
Your observation that schools and universities operate more like indoctrination centers is very interesting. So I've had quite a lot of people say that to me over the last 3-4 years, which is very, very interesting emerging pattern there as well. One thing that I also wanted to mention to you is back at home in London, I had this friend from Spain, and he, straight from university, managed to get a job at Norman Foster's design studio, or whatever that company is called. And he was super excited because obviously at that time, this was easily more than 15 years ago, if I remember correctly, Norman Foster, I've seen that in a bunch of journals that he had, that studio was the #1 studio in the world. I don't know why. I'm guessing because they were converting most opportunities into projects in places like Monaco and Dubai. And he managed to get in straight from university with no experience at all. And what I quite vividly remember is seeing this transformation in my friend from somebody who was initially very, very excited to somebody who started to sound a little bit depressed and then more and more depressed as the time passed, because he was clocking in a lot of overtime. He was working, 10, 11, 12-hour days and working on the weekend. They had quite a competitive culture where everyone was putting a lot of overtime because it was just normalized. And I remember sitting down with him, and he said to me, I think I made a mistake. I studied the wrong thing, and this
Yeah.
isn't what I thought it was going to be. It was just really interesting to see that sadness. And obviously, something like this would not be unique to architecture. Kids come out of universities and they join the workforce, and they get disappointed because the work is not necessarily what they thought it would be. And I'm pretty sure that's the case with medical schools, and then going and working at a hospital as well, or any other industry, if you want to put it that way.
Yeah, well, I would say I can't speak to why someone can't get out of their career or they're not happy in their career or whatever, but um, I would say that I imagine now I'm very much insular in my architectural world, that I don't follow any magazines, I don't read any architectural literature. You could name, the leading architect in London. I would not have a clue who you're talking about. It's I don't know any of it. I don't read any of it. It's irrelevant. It's noise and nonsense. Um, as long as hideous buildings, I think we have to keep going back to. There's always highbrow intellectual conversations about the buildings have to be like this, and the building, the contextual relationship between man and the void, and the verticality that's introduced to the city, and there's such guff displayed by architects about buildings that we have to keep saying, just quite simply, this is an ugly building. It's not nice. It's unattractive. It's unsightly. No matter how much you say the entrance hall, the atrium is like it's cantilevering and it's defying all engineering and it's won all these awards, it's irrelevant. These awards are modernists giving modernists awards. Now, I don't even know if modernist is the term anymore, but I'll just use that. It's the awards don't really mean anything. There's a joke that, well, if the building leaks, then it will probably win an award. And I think that if people are presented with the alternative for a beautiful building, and um, the cost is similar to the hideous building, then they'll choose the beautiful building. Now, I would say that all buildings, whether it's classical or a modernist building, this must be remembered, that the difference between them in cost is only about 10%, because everything else is just shared cost. The cost of the lifts, the radiators, the radiator system, the stairs, the piping, the electricity. These are all shared costs. And but on the other end, I would say that if you are spending, let's just say for argument's sake, 10% more on the classical building, when it comes to sell that building, I think it would retain, if not grow, in its value rather than something that you would demolish. And now I say 10%, I don't know exactly, but in a lot of cases, particularly with houses, it's in fact cheaper to build traditional, because a glass wall, what they call a curtain wall, is far more expensive than having a sash window and an opening in a masonry wall. That glass is far more expensive. Cantilevering, expensive engineering solutions, rather than the traditional way of weight is carried over weight like a column. So when you look at a classical building, you see window over window, wall over wall. You can see visually in the outside where the weight is carried. But anyway, that's not very interesting. What is interesting relating to this is that 99% of people that ever see a building will only see the outside. They don't go inside to see all these architects' big ideas. They only see the outside. And so the face of a building must respect the city. If you want to be avant-garde and defy everything, now I would say the norm is avant-garde. If you do a classical building today, you are the avant-garde. You are departing from the norm, the convention. The convention is very much glass steel construction. But if you look at old cities, you'll often see that the money is spent on the front facade. The sides, the back are just masonry walls with simple windows, not much thought put to them. The windows might be just anywhere on the wall because they relate to what's happening inside. Whereas on the front, what's inside conforms to the facing wall. And this is the wall that greets people passing by. This is the part that we say, that's a beautiful building. That building has value. And you'll often see today that they will demolish an entire building and save the facade. Now, it's a pity they demolished the entire building. I suppose it's a blessing, at least, that they saved the facade. But these are very well built buildings. And I would say that architects have to think of how a building looks. Stop talking about form follows function and everything like that. Look to what worked in the past, what people like. Go to the beautiful part of your city. If someone won't take a wedding photograph in front of your grand building, it's not a beautiful building. There's a city, I think it might be Hong Kong or Singapore, where it's all modernist glass buildings, but they have a railway station which is early 20th century. You could call it classical. Maybe it's eclecticism, but it's certainly in the classical, traditional, it's crafted, handmade building in that sense. This is a train station, yet everyone in that city, a lot of people at least, take their wedding photographs there. If you're designing a railway station, you should be aiming for people to be able to take their wedding photograph in front of it. So I think that we can make things better if we start making things beautiful.
It's an interesting test because people, I think, innately understand and feel, probably more importantly, feel what is beautiful, and they feel that magnetic pull towards that, which really explains, like, you have all these modern buildings in Singapore or Hong Kong or wherever that train station is, but all the wedding photographers say, no, let's go there because that's going to be the most beautiful backdrop for your memorable day. All right, how about we pivot towards something more positive now? Because we've been sitting here like two negative Nancys having a whinge about state of play in architecture, but there are positives, and this is really the story of how I came across you. So when I was doing a bit of research, I got basically really curious around who's doing classical projects out there, what techniques are being used, what the designs look like, what technology is being used. I came across those short videos that you posted from Budapest. And I thought, how interesting. They were pretty well made, very short, to the point, and they were quite positive in its sort of messaging. And I thought, I'm keen to find out more, this is the story of this interview, really. That's how I wanted to bring you on. But please tell us, what were you doing in Hungary, and what did you see? What is really going on there? Because they seem to be working on some beautiful classical designs.
Yes, I was there to see the new buildings, or rather rebuildings, on Castle Hill in Budapest. Now, I say new buildings because they are new. These sites were either empty or they had different buildings on the site, and these are new constructions. Now, they have to work within conventions of the time, which is mostly concrete and steel. And you have to, just for basic economics, or else the budget would go way over. They can't build it in solid stone or solid brick. They've used concrete, but on the outside, they do have stonework, and these buildings cost a lot to construct. But the government taking this burden of cost on Castle Hill will actually make it less expensive for other businesses and people in Budapest to hire stonemasons, craftsmen who have now come into this career through the production of these buildings. It's called the Houseman Program, and I think it started a couple of years ago, but it's a number of buildings on Castle Hill which will house the government departments in Hungary, and it's very much led by the national government. The city government have been against it, so much so that as a hope to stop or slow down the beautification of Castle Hill, they have listed the hideous Hilton Hotel, which is facing the River Danube, and it's an awful 1970s facade. And they listed this as a way of stopping its demolition and replacement with something baroque, something like it would have been originally. These buildings, interestingly, were not damaged beyond repair, all of them. One or two of them were demolished. When I saw photographs, you could see why. Okay, they demolished that. Didn't have time to reconstruct it. But the Royal Riding Hall, it had a caved-in roof in part, but it looked repairable. But the Soviets pulled these buildings down because Budapest was, I suppose, like Dresden in Germany. In fact, I think this might tie into perhaps why Germany was such a target, Dresden was such a target. These cities were such icons of beauty. They were Baroque cities. There was craftsmanship and statuary, and the skyline was domes and spires. And um, the Soviets. When I was in Budapest, I was told by a Hungarian that Soviets removed the skyline, which they saw as bourgeoisie or bourgeois, um, the columns and spires, the domes and the spires. They removed them because they wanted to reduce the status of the city, and they did that with the classical buildings as well. Now, why I was there was to see these constructions, and it was quite spontaneous decision to make the videos, and they turned out well. So I put a few of them on Twitter, and I will return to see them further along, and I'll probably do some more videos when I'm there. But we had a tour of all the buildings, and the detail, it's fantastic. I was blown away. I'd recommend anyone to go to Budapest and visit Castle Hill. Um, it's amazing, and the architects. I said the city government was against it. The architectural establishment in Hungary was also against it. They said it was pastiche. It was everything the Hungarians, when I was there, told me. It just brought me back to university. And I thought, to hell with them. Like, this is the same thing they told me, and they're going to keep saying it. And they just want to do these glass buildings everywhere. But what I saw in Castle Hill, these new buildings, they were Hungarian classical. This is the great thing about the classical tradition. It's born of antiquity, of Rome and Greece, but it finds its way. It finds its national and regional aesthetic and character in whatever country it's built. And these classical buildings in Budapest would not, they would look out of place in London, but they're very much suited to Budapest. And whereas the glass buildings you could build anywhere in the world and they don't have an attachment to the place, they are soulless, they have no rootedness. And I think that you could say, oh, that's the point. It's trying to make everywhere the same. And it is making everywhere the same. I don't think that's necessarily the point. I think it is, well, at least from the architects I've spoken to who do design like that, that's not something they would at least say that is an intention, but it certainly is a consequence. These buildings had great attention to detail on the columns, the archways, the cornices, and there were some compromises. So the dome of the High Command building is going to be glazed rather than have a decorative tile, and it's meant to be for views. Now, I think it's going to consume a lot of energy just to keep that keep that cool in the summer and heated in the winter. But anyway, that's what's going to happen, and that was a compromise. But it's glass, and in the future they can remove it and put slate in. So we'll see. But it was amazing, and we went right to the top of the cupola, the dome, and we took in the views and interviewed a few people there, and we were welcomed amazingly. Um, they welcomed us and hosted us incredibly well in Budapest, and We ate Hungarian food every night, and everyone there was fascinated by new classical architecture, what's happening in England in terms of domestic architecture with Poundbury and Tornagrain and Lansleden and places like that. But what I saw in Budapest is certainly the most significant and historically important moment for new classical architecture in my lifetime. That it's so many substantial buildings, public buildings, all built at once in a major city. And I do believe that out there are people from Paris or Amsterdam, and they've seen this, and soon they might be in a role to make decisions in their city, and they will say to the architectural establishment, no, we've played to your tune for 80 years, and your buildings, you give a great speech, congratulations, the speech, the articles, fantastic, the photographs, next to nothing, like fantastic. But no, we are going to think of the long term of the city, and we are going to build upon the tradition of those we inherited the city from, and we want to build in the character and the traditions of our city. And the Hungarians have held their line in terms of doing that in Budapest. And I'm optimistic that the same could happen in Munich, in Amsterdam, in Paris. I didn't say Berlin; I said Munich because Berlin, there's just it's the modernist headquarters. Um, I haven't been there, but I've seen enough of Berlin to see that it's concrete everywhere, glass everywhere. It's yeah, but I will say, in the center of Berlin, despite what I just said there, they are rebuilding the city palace, which is called the Berliner Stadtschloss, the Berlin City Palace. And this is a beautiful Baroque building with incredible craftsmanship, modern day craftsmanship. This is cut stone today with a modern dome, but it's in the Baroque tradition. It is a reconstruction of what was there. But despite being a reconstruction, it is a way in which craftsmen are learning their trade, and it's showing Germans that we can build like this. And in Potsdam, they've done the same with the Potsdam City Palace again, and they are building some other buildings around that to recreate the square as it was. And it just shows you that architecture is so important to a place. For Potsdam to feel like Potsdam, they need to recreate this square. They need to bring back some of the streets that were lost. Otherwise, it's not. It loses the heart of the city. Um,
So it sounds like to me, if the will is there and there's enough buy-in by all the stakeholders, and a classical project is on the blueprint and there's enough financial backing, we can actually deliver a project of this type. Because I'm saying this because when I was watching your videos, I was kind of quite astounded. I thought that we can't really build like this anymore. That we've lost the wisdom of how to do it.
yes, a lot of these projects I've mentioned are reconstructions, so they you see in some films that they have fantastic film sets. Titanic, for example, they built the interiors and they look absolutely spot on. Um, Reconstructions, then, in that sense, because you're using the archive, it is different to creating a new building. And you are right in saying that um, there are new traditional buildings, so to speak, that are quite awfully executed. And it is that you cannot find architects who can design in that way. They've had no training whatsoever. And then you go to a builder and he does something, I suppose, close to what you're thinking of, but the proportions are all wrong. And what makes the classical tradition, the rule of thumb, the size of a cornice, it has to be a particular size in relation to the facade. And I so often see these details and the proportions and the composition just completely wrong. And they say, oh, it's traditional building. And I can see that the client, the patron of the building, clearly wanted to do something that was in keeping. but just failed. Um, and I think that it does start at the architectural schools. Now, in starting at the architectural schools, it has started outside of them. So with summer schools, for the last 2 years, I have been going for a couple of days to Bruges and to Utrecht to teach classical architecture and, well, mostly to teach how to draw correctly, draw these buildings, measure them, look for the details, how to draw the details, getting it right. And most of the students are architects, and they tell me stories that sound exactly like my experience. And older architects I work with and have worked with, um, who work in the classical tradition, say the exact same thing. So the experience that I had is very much the same experience these students are having today. But these summer schools are popular, they're growing in demand for them. And I think if any of the listeners are thinking of pursuing a career in classical architecture, I certainly would advise going to Europe in the summer. Um, and there's one in Bruges, one in Utrecht. The one in Utrecht is, I think, Building a Beautiful City, I think it's called. And the one in Bruges is La Ronde de l'Architecture, so the round table of architecture, but in French, of course. And these are the two schools that I've helped out at. There are schools, summer courses in Oxford and Cambridge, I believe. I haven't had no involvement in those, but I would go there because not only will you meet like minded people, that will give you great encouragement. Going to these places will make you realize there's other people, other young architects who also want their city to be beautiful and want to create beautiful houses. Certainly know there's a market there for it. um, you will sideline in your city, in your town, you will sideline a lot of other graduates who are coming out and they all just know how to do the same class and steel whatever. And you coming in with an edge of knowing how to build in the tradition, building beautiful buildings. So I would recommend looking up and going to one of these courses.
That's very cool. Thank you for the guidance on where to find these courses. I'll put all the links in the show notes so that people can easily find them. Another question I have for you, and I've been thinking about this a little bit while preparing for this conversation, is if you think that what we're seeing in modern architecture and modernity is a consequence of our society secularizing over the last a century and a half, really. And what I mean by that is that just if one takes a look at one of the old cathedrals, you can take St. Paul's Cathedral, designed by Christopher Wren. That building is designed and it's built to celebrate God.
Yes.
Equally, you can take a look at the works of the old music composers, deeply religious people that wrote music to celebrate God, and nobody can compose, write, or execute symphonies in that manner today. So I just would love to hear your take on it.
Yes, for the first part, what you said, modernity, I would say that modernity doesn't belong to modernism. That when we build a classical building today, I would consider it a modern building. The modernists were very clever to attach the term modern and essentially the present time to their movement, meaning you're forever in the present, you're forever the most relevant, which is completely not the case. There's no one more traditionalist than a modernist at the moment. In fact, it's the traditionalists, or rather the classicists, who are the most avant-garde. They are the most passionate, doing all sorts of things. You could get 10 classicists in a room and get 10 incredibly different buildings. Whereas if you put 10 modernists in a room, you're going to see a lot of traditionalists who build very similar constructions. But later in what you said, this is very much the crux of it. Architects are about me. They design in quote unquote their own style. And when you do that, you are competing with yourself. Architects talk of a language, an architectural language that the building is speaking. Now, the thing about the me architects, which the big architects, most architects, I think, are, and you're taught to be that way in university, very much so. What is your style of architecture? Discover your style. That is very much at the root of throughout the education. Now, I said my style is the classical tradition. That was the wrong answer. But the me, when you are speaking your own language, so to speak, you're in the ring with yourself, and therefore no one can apparently objectively compare you to anything else because it's just you competing against your other projects. When you're in the classical tradition, you're standing in the ring with Christopher Wren. You're standing in the ring with Andrea Palladio. You're speaking the same language as the great masters of the past. You're going to be compared to them. You will compare yourself to them. But as you're speaking the same language, you will also bring them into the present. So when at the moment, I'm designing a building in India in the Palladian tradition. So this is after the 16th century Venetian architect Andrea Palladio. Well, I say Venetian, Vincenza of northern Italy, and he designed classical buildings. But Andrea Palladio is long dead, but he lives on through his buildings, and what he designed is very much relevant today as much as it will be relevant in hundreds of years' time. And I'm taking ideas from him and how he uh, came up with the composition. And through my understanding of what he has done, I've created a new building that is similar to his work but is different, and but it's in his tradition. So by understanding his tradition, I'm building in that way. And yeah, you're in the ring, you're speaking to the past and many generations. It's not all about you speaking to yourself. Um, and it does make for a more pleasant city. You don't have buildings that, well, rather, you have buildings that sit comfortably side by side in harmony, as opposed to maybe the city of London, where you have a jostle of buildings all competing for attention, and each one says architect A, architect B, architect C. You can imagine the architect's name printed on the building, and they're all vying for attention. They've all done something slightly different, and all this sort of thing. The architect should be silent. The building should speak for itself, and it should be able to speak alongside its neighbors. You can't have a city that each building is competing and shouting. The buildings that are important are placed in important positions. You have the opera halls, the cathedrals, the main railway stations, not an office block, not a shopping center entrance. These things should sit into a street comfortably, and not all buildings have to be wow. This is another thing which architects are trained in a way in university as though they're going to be architects, they're going to be the next big thing, but you're not. Some do, and they have a particular talent, a way about it, and they go in that way. But most architects will just be building whatever it's houses, offices in their city, in their town. And if you can build an ordinary building in your town, that is you're a great benefit to your town. If you can stitch together a street, create nice shop fronts, well proportioned buildings, they have handsome faces, and they're built well, that is a gift to the city, and your city will thank you for it. Not all buildings have to stand out and say architect A was here. Um, and yeah, I would just say that the ordinary building, the average building, just like the ordinary person walking down the street, we're not all, not everyone is a celebrity walking down the street. That is a good thing. It's the buildings sit in harmony. They're in conversation with each other, not competing. And I think, personally thinking, it does create a more happy population, happy. happier people, less anxiety, and it's a more pleasant place to be. And what I mean by that is not just to walk through, but to sit and admire. And there's trees, and you're looking at the handsome buildings around you. There's a lovely shop front, and that attracts you in. You mightn't want to get a book, but it looks like it's a lovely. I have half an hour to spend, and there's a beautiful shop front I've never seen before. I'm going to go inside. It's not just a glass plate with an opening,
Mm.
and yeah, I think architects have to take responsibility for this. But the universities are still very much modernist, modernist controlled.
I'm just being mindful of the time. We've agreed today to chat for an hour, and I'm looking at the clock, and we've done slightly over an hour now. So, bringing this to its conclusion, what kind of a positive message would you give to young people who might be listening to this and are contemplating going into architecture business? Like, what would you say to them?
I would say, in closing, that the classical tradition, although it might not seem like it, is certainly in the ascendancy. The young classicists today are quite similar, perhaps, to the modernists of the early 20th century, in the sense that they are not driven by, oh, I just want to be an architect, it's a career, I'll go into that, whatever. It is a mission. It is, I'm pursuing beauty. My city has ugly buildings over the last half a century. I don't like it. My family doesn't like it. No one I know likes it. And I can draw. I have ideas to how to create beautiful buildings, and I'm going to bring that forward. And no matter, and throughout university, it the lecturers do test your mettle. So in a way, it's a good thing, perhaps, to in a sense that because the universities are so against the classical tradition, those who come out the other end um, in favor of it are just completely committed because they've been tested throughout, tested their mettle, they're passionate, and of those I've met, particularly in the architectural schools, it's all their time. It's not just working hours. It's all their hours. It's all their time. It's their free time. It's their passion. It's their friends. The the passionate modernists, are of a much older generation, and the star architects and the famous architects in London, wherever else. But I think that a lot of the younger generation are just following. They're just um, doing the motions, as opposed to the young classical architects who are completely driven in a different way. I'm not saying that if you're doing if you prefer a minimalist building, that you're not driven, but the classical architects are in the trenches, and that means that of those that there are, they are all the more committed. So they're smaller in number, significantly smaller in number, but extremely committed. And yeah, the future is not written, and I certainly, for one, and there are other many friends of mine, young classical architects, who we want to see beauty come back, and we've got our whole lives ahead of us to do that.
There's one question I forgot to ask you, and I'm just looking at the list of questions, and I should have actually asked that a little bit earlier in the conversation, but let's maybe try to cover this as the last one. When we talked offline, you've mentioned to me the city extension project in Guatemala. Since then, I had a look at that project on the Aesthetic City podcast, and they have a really nice YouTube channel where they talk a lot about architecture, and that project looks absolutely stunning. So I was wondering if you could maybe, before we sign off for today, if you could talk to us a little bit about what you know about that specific project.
I can't speak to that with great knowledge, apart from it was the developers decided actively. It was a family developers who have a connection to the city, and they saw this as an opportunity to create something beautiful rather than just the next run of the mill apartment blocks. They wanted to create something truly special, and they had this land. They had uh, ideas to develop it, and so Leon Creer, who designed the layout for Poundbury, which was a great success in the 90s, and he continues to do that today. Poundbury will be completed in the next 2 years or so. He brought his knowledge of urbanism, the layout of the streets, the way in which the roads meander. They create interesting views for people by foot. You have the existing view and the emerging view. The streets bend so that it's a straight line. If you can see the end of the street a mile away, that's far less interesting than if there's a bend, and it brings everything a bit closer, like a large room, an enclosure, as opposed to just avenues for cars. And he's done this in Guatemala, where there is a main street. It's slightly wider. It tapers in and it comes out again into a square. And um, from what I've seen, it looks fantastic. Its success, I can only presume, has been good because these projects are built in phases. You'll often see phase one, and if the market likes it, they'll do phase two and then phase three and so on. And this seems to be getting bigger and bigger, which, although I don't know the numbers, the knowledge of that says this has been a success. Guatemalans seem to be liking it. And it's a place that people want to be. It's not a satellite. It's not somewhere you drive into the city, but you live there. It's got its own high street, so to speak, and it's laid out to lend itself to community building. Now, whether that's happened, I can't answer that, but certainly the ingredients architecturally are there for community, for walkability, for mixed use, mixed density, and I think it's a significant project, and people should look at the photographs. Leon Creer is a genius.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'll put a link to the video in the show notes as well, so do check it out because it's a beautiful, beautiful project. And if you're interested in classical design, have a look at it. It's truly stunning. All right, let's try to wrap this up for real now. Tell me, how can people find you? Where are you posting? Where are you writing? And also, what are you planning to do over the next few years? Like, what are you going to occupy yourself with?
Yes, well, thank you very much for having me, first of all. And people can find me on Twitter, or rather X as it's called now. And I have the same username there as I have on Instagram and everywhere else, which is at C_K_Lynch. I've recently started a TikTok. Not that I make TikTok videos, so to speak, but rather the videos I have been making for Twitter and Instagram that can get memory hold because they fall down the timeline. TikTok is a nice place to just catalog them, place them. And I'm going to, because of the good reception of the videos I've made, I probably will make more videos about architecture and country houses and other aspects, my drawings, things like that. But what I'm going to do is hopefully now continue designing classical buildings. I'm focusing on country houses, residential architecture, so to speak. But what I would love to do, and I certainly will be doing drawings in the probably over this year, is a civic building, a railway station, an airport, a library, whatever it might be, something that is used by the public and furnishes the public realm. And that would be, I think, a great win for classical architecture, because as soon as people see that we don't have to build ugly buildings, that's the end. The show's over. And as soon as when people know that you can build beautifully, then the market for that will grow rapidly.
Well, I certainly hope that's the case. This was a good closing statement, quite positive in its outlook. So thank you very much for that, Conor. And I just want to say thank you very much for making time for me and taking a punt on doing this recording. After all, the show is in a very nascent phase of its development. So I really appreciate you saying yes to me. This was great. And good luck with all the projects and initiatives that you're involved with. Hopefully at some point in the future we'll bring you back for round 2, because there's a bunch of things which I think we just simply run out of time and didn't cover. But I think it would be interesting for us to deep dive into those questions and topics as well. So hopefully at some point in the near future. In the meantime, all the best. Keep up the great work, and I'll catch you around. Take it easy, Conor. Bye-bye. I have really enjoyed listening to what Conor had to say today, and I hope you did too. I'm a mere dilettante when it comes to matters of architecture and construction engineering, but I love learning new things, and as I've stated in the opening introduction, I love things that are beautifully designed as much as I love classicism. It's no secret, I do have a massive bias. It's been a while since I've talked to an architect, and having just recorded this conversation with Conor, I found his industry insights quite interesting. Perhaps a little bit depressing at times, as he's managed to clarify the incentive structure that's leading to what we've described in the conversation as prefabricated face of modern architecture we see all over the world today. Are modern architects too egocentric? Do they lack ambition and courage to break out of the rigid conventions of modernity? I really don't know, and it's really not for me to judge. I am hopeful though, because people like Conor are out there. There might be a small minority group, but that doesn't really matter that much. If history is to be a guide here, a lot of revolutions were led by small, well-organized bands who wanted to change the status quo. I'm not saying a revolution needs to happen, but some form of diversification would be nice. Being in a minority in this context could be an advantage. You never know. Let me finish with this. Prince Lev Nikolaevich Mishkin, one of the characters in Fyodor Dostoevsky's The Idiot, famously said, "I believe the world will be saved by beauty." A lot of academics have pondered what that line means. A lot of philosophers have contemplated its weight. Does beauty have the power to transcend aesthetics and illuminate us, inspiring what's best in us? You have a deep think about that before you start your next creative project. Thank you for listening, and see you next time.